Our next speaker really needs no introduction. He is the White House Special Assistant to President Biden and is the U.S. National Security Council Senior Director for the Western Hemisphere, Mr. Juan Gonzalez. And the moderator to speak to him today will be our very own Brian Fonseca, Director of the Jack Gordon Institute.
Director Gonzalez, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Apologize for the delay. We were having some technical difficulties.
No worries. I'm so grateful that you showed up because apparently I was on the hook to dance if you didn't, and so I'm grateful that you showed up. So Director Gonzalez, I've essentially, you don't need an introduction, although we've given you one already. But it's clear that you have an incredibly important role in the White House, leading not just the formation, but the implementation of American national security policy towards the region. And so I wanted to just toss to you maybe for some opening comments, then I'll ask a few questions, and then I'll certainly weave the audience into the conversation. So with that, let me turn it over to you and see if you got any opening thoughts for us.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I apologize for not being able to join you in person, but as you said, it's an intense pace over here. So I had to stay in DC, but I'm glad that my colleagues, including Dan Erickson, were able to join you. And I have no doubt that if you were left to do the song and dance, that you would do an amazing job of outlining really U.S. interests in the Americas, just given, I think, the role and just the reservoir of expertise and understanding that you brought to FIU. So really honored to be sharing this space with you. Look, I want to maybe start big, and then in the conversation we can zero in on specific countries. And the reason for that is that Secretary Yellen recently gave a speech on kind of our view to cooperating and competing with China. And then just a few days ago, Jake Sullivan put that speech into perspective in terms of our foreign policy. And so what I want to do is really put into perspective what he talked about, the direction that the president has given us to integrate domestic and foreign policy and really what that means for the Americas. And I'll try to be as brief as possible, certainly not as articulate as Jake Sullivan, but I think of relevance to our discussion today. When we first came in, we confronted, I think, a number of challenges, four that I would note very briefly. The first is that America's industrial base had been hollowed out. I think based on the premise that markets will always allocate capital productively and effectively, as well as on the assumption that just any economic growth was good, and it did not matter what type. All of this, I think, over, without getting into the details of something that I'm not a full expert in, I think to say that it really privileged one sector, particularly the financial sector, at the expense of others, particularly our manufacturing capability that after World War II really is one of the main platforms that made the United States the economic and geopolitical superpower that it is today. The second was that we were faced with the need to adapt to a new environment defined by geopolitical competition. Again, on the economic side, there's this premise that our economic policy focused on trade and integration would lead to greater economic cooperation, peace, and collaboration among all states. But lo and behold, there's a major non-market economy, China, that we have to contend with, that is subsidizing its particular sectors, is engaging in an anti-competitive behavior, and also efforts to integrate Russia into the G20 over the years did not prevent it from invading Ukraine. And certainly Latin America and the Caribbean, where we have the largest quantity of free trade agreements, it has, in some cases, definitely led to closer integration, cooperation, and peace, but in others it has not. So it's been an uneven impact. And the third is faced with an accelerating climate crisis and an urgent need for us to adapt the United States and certainly to galvanize the world in a just and efficient energy transition. And then lastly, one that I think is being in stark perspective in the Americas, which is inequality and its damage to democratic governance. Under the prevailing assumption, again, that trade would inevitably make countries more inclusive, would strengthen institutions, and would lead to more even growth. Now the response to that has had significant implications, and I think also opportunities for us in the Americas. I would say the response, the priority response has been one that many of you have heard has been really investing on American competitiveness, investing at home, based on, again, pursuing modern industrial and innovation strategy, primarily at home. We've seen the Inflation Reduction Act, CHIPS Act, bipartisan infrastructure bill, all which has really galvanized investment, particularly not crowding out the private sector, but crowding in the private sector in a way where the private sector is set up to do best, which is to innovate, scale, and compete. That's something that has really bolstered the United States. And it has been really around diversified and resilient supply chains, a clear and high standard for labor and environment, but also trusted technologies and good governance, and frankly, in a way that deploys capital to deliver on public goods and is based on the recognition that there is no trade-off between addressing climate and promoting jobs. As the president has said on numerous occasions, when he thinks of climate, he thinks of jobs. It has been something that has been borne out in terms of really the predictions of how the U.S. is looking to compete, not just in the semiconductor field, but also in electric vehicles and a whole host of other areas as a result of legislation, largely bipartisan, that has been passed here in the United States. Now, as we invest at home, the North American platform is one that becomes of enormous strategic importance. And just like the president's rationale for first sharing vaccines in 2021 with Canada and with Mexico was based on the notion that the United States would never come out of the pandemic if our neighbors to the north and to the south did not come out of the pandemic. Similarly, the investments that we are making in the U.S. economy are ones that, if we're able to really coordinate and collaborate actively with our North American partners, that it'll make the United States more competitive around the world. And you've seen, I think, notwithstanding a lot of the news coverage on migration, certainly the disagreements that we have with both Mexico and Canada on a number of issues, the North American Leaders Summit is one that has produced concrete outcomes on cooperation on semiconductors, the mapping of critical mineral supply chains, areas to really facilitate and collaborate on the clean energy transition, and a number of other areas. Now, beyond North America, and this is in the National Security Strategy that was released last year, you have the America's Partnership for Economic Prosperity, which is a framework around which we are doing, and I'm going to say something that people that have followed this issue, I think will remember. Robert Zoellick, right before leaving the job of U.S. Trade Representative, wrote this great op-ed in the Wall Street Journal called Happily Ever After, with the double A's, and where he argued that the trade agreements that we have provide a base or a foundation for cooperation that we should take full advantage of, and that we should create an association. What the APEP does is it really starts working with our free trade partners to build on that foundation, and doing it by prioritizing our efforts to friendshore, to invest in digital technology, to really ensure that we are renewing the social contract between governments and people, meaning ensuring that democracies are delivering for their populations in an effective way. And that's really the crux of the APEP initiative, similar to what we're doing in other parts of the world. We have obviously the IPEF and the US-EU Trade and Technology Council as a way to really take the economic relationships that we have built over decades and to actually be much more ambitious in advancing not just our domestic goals, but our global ones. And we're also linking trade to climate in a way that has never been done before. The president at the Major Economies Forum meeting announced $500 million to invest in the Amazon Fund, which is an enormous amount. But also, I think the global arrangement that is being negotiated on steel and aluminum is something that really makes sure that our trade is a race to the top on the environment and not a race to the bottom. And then lastly, 2 points is, and I think this gets to areas of the discussion that we're going to have, Brian, which is really gets to some of the challenges of working or using the tools we have that were developed to address challenges in poor or low-income countries or countries that are in conflict. The challenges of working in Latin America and the Caribbean is that they are majority middle income or upper middle income, and that a lot of the tools that we have, meaning concessional tools that we have in other areas, we don't have in Latin America and the Caribbean. And our answer to that issue, to that challenge, is obviously evolution at the multilateral development banks. This is something that we're leading in the multilateral space. We have an excellent dialogue with very capable presidency of the Inter-American Development Bank and Alain Golpan, and look forward to working with Ajay Banga when he takes over at the World Bank. And not to kind of list through all the details, but I would note that we're also reforming the DFC so that it can assume equity in investments and be able to do a lot more in middle and upper middle income countries. Both of the 2018 Bipartisan Build Act. We've put into the FY24 request $74 million to assume an equity stake in IDB Invest. That's something that if Congress approves it and we're able to negotiate an outcome, is about making sure that we are focusing on helping the private sector play a key role in addressing some of the challenges that we're facing in the Americas. And then lastly, the point I'll make is gets to kind of the political engagement piece. And this is laid out very clearly in the national security strategy and the discussions that we've had last year and things that we've said publicly, is that this administration has really worked very hard to do away with the Cold War mentality in picking who our friends are and our enemies are. And really the focus of our engagement has been one that has recognized that we need to be able to engage with democratically elected leaders, regardless of where they are on the ideological spectrum. And that has really been borne out in places like Colombia, places like Brazil, and places like Argentina, where that has actually, I think, built a reservoir of trust with the countries of the region. They see that we are going to respect some of the political debates that are taking place in places like Colombia, where the democratic institutions in that country are more than adept at handling those, and we're not going to be a political actor, but we will express our national security interests candidly and unabashedly. But it has allowed us to really, at a time when the countries of the Americas, they voted to reject at the UN General Assembly Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but over time, really the argument of authoritarian versus democracy to continue the Americas kind of being on sides and rejecting Russian aggression. At the end of the day, what the countries of the region are looking at is a developed world that is on the cusp of major technological and scientific breakthroughs. And ultimately, when they're looking to govern, particularly as democracies, they really want to see that the United States is committed to making sure that they have a seat at the table, that we're engaging constructively with them, and that we're not really in a place where we're expressing selective moral outrage on matters of democratic governance based on whether a country agrees with us or not, and sticking very, very at the core of our engagement, the respect for democratic institutions. So I'll leave it there. I think that opens a space for us to discuss particular countries and for me to drill down into some of these issues. I hope that was useful. Thank you.
No, thanks, Juan. I appreciate that. There's a lot I want to build on. And I know you made some comments that probably going to answer questions that I have, but I want to double back to them, particularly as you talk about sort of strategic competition. So I'm going to touch on some things around strategic competition. I do want to touch on, sort of the Petro, Lula, those that you sort of referenced that might have an agenda that seems highly antithetical to American interest, and sort of how you view it from the NSC space. And then I want to talk a little bit more about insecurity, because I think that's been an important theme of the conference today so far, and certainly an important part of the work that you're doing from the White House. So going back to strategic competition, and not to undermine the panel that we're going to have later on today, But you talked about two areas that I think are really vital to American interests in the region, and that's the area of critical minerals and technology, sort of tech proliferation. And you talk about sort of mechanisms to try to inspire, the U.S. private sector into that space, but we're just not seeing a huge effort from the American private sector to want to move into some of these markets and start to compete, dollar for dollar, which may seem impossible, but compete directly, with China. It seems to be making huge investments, particularly in those two spaces. I mean, it's clear that technology proliferation is happening across the hemisphere, and it's not just sort of in the digital infrastructure space, but also in sort of the norms and values around sort of the implementation or operationalizing of technology, but also in the critical mineral space. If you look in sort of the Lithium Triangle alone, China has been hugely aggressive at, buying up the critical mineral space. So how do we really incentivize, American enterprises or those that want to compete with China in those markets? How do we do that from a policy perspective?
It's an excellent question. It's a big one. Let me start with the environment. I think the first related to question is, what are the reasons that a lot of companies do not invest? And you can see studies that the World Economic Forum has done is frankly, it's political and economic risk in the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean. I think governance is a significant concern, where in some places the lack of respect for contracts, lack of predictability in investments is something that particularly countries that have the companies that whose investments require large capital outlays will demur when it comes to Latin America and the Caribbean. Notwithstanding, at a time when a lot of companies are leaving China, there have been a dramatic increase in foreign direct investment in places like Mexico. Certainly, that could be much larger if Mexico had competitive policies in place that reassured the private sector. But when it comes to the issue of competition on critical minerals, specifically with China, it is, I'll say on its face, it's hard to compete with a sovereign fund that is being deployed often for political purposes, right? And that's, the U.S., I think, being a capitalist system, is not going to develop a sovereign wealth fund. Maybe we will, but so how do you actually give the private sector the tools to be able to compete? Early on, and this is something that when I was in the Obama administration, a lot of my colleagues, I think, were frustrated about, is we would have countries that would come to us and say, whether it was 5G, whether it was critical minerals, whether it was other areas, they said, we only have Chinese SOEs or companies with Chinese subs bidding on these. Why aren't U.S. companies bidding? You actually had the situation where Exim could not actually give credit or risk insurance. We did not have the tools at DFC. So these are things that we're starting to change. The other part I would say is that something that Undersecretary Jose Fernandez has done very effectively is a mineral security partnership, which is bringing together other countries to be able to identify opportunities and deploy capital so that whether it's U.S. or allies that will respect certain norms are able to compete. And there have been, I think, some successes in that regard, but a lot more, I think, needs to be done. The challenge I will say, and this is something that needs to be worked on, is there is no clearinghouse. It's not very obvious always when there are going to be particular opportunities that will allow kind of the timeline in the run-up to build a project proposal. And that's something that there's an opportunity, I think, to build, actually creating a clearinghouse or an opportunity so that when it comes to these sort of deals, there's a very transparent process. And that's something that really can only benefit the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean, because it opens the door to other bidders. But then the last point I'll mention is, the Partnership for Global Infrastructure is something that is a part of our MDB reform, or as a part of really retooling the U.S. government to be able to compete and work with our allies. That is something that is designed to be able to deploy capital and to engage constructively with allies without anything in return. I think one of the buyer's remorse that often countries in Latin America and the Caribbean will have over Chinese engagement is that it usually comes at a political cost. Vaccines were not given away like we gave them away. They were sold, and they're usually in return for political commitments. The deployment of Chinese lending or investment infrastructure always comes at a political cost. And the way the president talks about it is that we really need to expand the quantum of capital, not just that is deployed by the United States, but by MDBs, so that we're giving tools and agency to our partners, particularly in those in Latin America and the Caribbean. And I would say it's an ongoing process.
Yeah, thanks for that, Juan. And I couldn't agree more. I think there's also got to be a real recalibration of the relationship between the U.S. government and the U.S. private sector. I think there's tension at the right moments, and I think that's really important, and I think that's consistent with our values. But I think, again, we need to draw greater connective tissue between sort of, U.S. government and how we inspire private sector to move into strategic markets and compete in the interests of sort of the U.S., not just from an economic perspective, but also from a national security perspective. Because I think that's one of the challenges that we have in terms of staying par with China, is that China, for example, can leverage its state-owned enterprises to advance its own foreign policy interests unapologetically, and doesn't have the same disconnect that we have, or at least the same sort of respect between private sector and public sectors that we have. So it's something that I think we still have to continue to double down. You couldn't see it from where you were, but you went off screen for a moment. And I say that only because every time I talk about Chinese and tech proliferation, something happens with the technology in the room. And I'm not blaming them. Maybe not. Maybe it's the Russians making it look like the Chinese. I don't know, but something undoubtedly goes down. But again, that's another one on the tech proliferation. I mean, as we continue to see the proliferation, not just of digital, but also in the the booming artificial intelligence space, we know that China is moving aggressively to have a dominant share of that global market. And Latin America is a place where we're seeing them, sort of Chinese enterprises be really aggressive in terms of eating up market share. So I think that's going to be something that's going to require enduring American policy to foster that transcends administrations, much like their own Belt and Road Initiative, which now has a 10-year tenure as a policy. So let me get to the next question, and you sort of brought it out with as you referenced Lula, Brazil, and Colombia, and we heard a little bit about that earlier today. So I think there's been some recent announcements by President Lula to sort of convene a group of leaders in South America to be sort of exclusive of the United States, to ensure the United States. So it's almost sort of a revisiting of the kinds of collective blocks that that we've seen in the past that tend to be sort of countering American interests or U.S. national interests. What are your perspectives on sort of what that means, the rise of governments that tend to have less affinity or affiliation with American policy? What are your perspectives on that, and how does the administration walk the delicate balance of wanting to engage but also standing steadfast for American interests as it engages in that space?
Yeah, Brian, just briefly to your last question, I think you're exactly right about the need to engage with industry. And I'll note as an example, in 2 weeks in Arizona, the Secretary of Commerce is going to be launching with her North American counterparts a semiconductor alliance, and it's going to be the first of its kind, basically space for dialogue with industry and government, so that all three governments can really coordinate and prioritize policies that support our North American efforts on semiconductor supply chains, because again, they're parts of the manufacturing supply chain that where Canada and Mexico have a comparative advantage, and as we expand in orders of magnitude in our capability, in our manufacturing capability, there are parts that'll make a perfect fit for the U.S., but they're ones that in cooperation with our partners in Canada and Mexico will make the U.S. even more competitive. Certainly, as a part of that effort, we are making sure that the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement has the highest standards for labor and environment associated with those. So it's again really a race to the top. On the issue of South America, let me say something on just regional integration, and then about Brazil specifically. So you may have seen that special advisor to the president and former Senator Chris Dodd went to the visit of meeting of the SELAC countries. And we did that intentionally because we wanted to carry a message to the countries of Latin America, even in a forum that did not include the United States and Canada. And that was basically to say any effort at integration and good governance is something that fundamentally is in support of U.S. national security interests, even if it isn't always one that agrees with us. It is viewed positively from the United States. Similarly, efforts like UNASUR and others, really, those efforts should be judged by the outcomes that they produce. Do countries like Brazil have a different view of the world? I think they do somewhat, and I think they have a very sophisticated foreign policy that isn't always aligned with us. They reject sanctions and the use of sanctions in any sort of situation. And I think fundamentally there are two trends in Brazilian foreign policy: one that is very pragmatic, and one that is nationalist in its view that maybe the United States, suspicion that the United States really does not support a global leadership role for countries like Brazil. And I think mistakenly, I think they believe it when Russia says that they want Brazil to have a seat on the UN Security Council. But I don't think anybody credibly really believes that Russia, as a free rider on the council, would ever want another permanent member. So what do we do in that environment? I think what we do is we need to be able to articulate our national security interests to Brazil in a very clear way that really underscores that we support Brazil having a leadership role on all global matters, particularly as people are debating whether the G20 has a future. What is the future of the United Nations, the Organization of American States? Often they will view those discussions as ones that are U.S. and NATO-led and then prescribed to the global South. I think that nobody had on their bingo card that Russia was going to invade Ukraine. And that, I think, by definition, has had us very focused on our traditional relationships with Europe. But now, I think, particularly with the election of Lula, somebody that the president has spoken to multiple times is an excellent relationship. We've been clear we support Brazil having a leadership role. At the same time, there are areas of international consensus, the UN founding charter that Brazil signed that we really cannot apply selectively, and that we need to adhere to a certain set of norms. But then again, to what I said at the beginning is that countries like Brazil see that there are revolutions in the implementation of artificial intelligence in the health sector, in the science sector, and much like in the run-up to World War II, our engagement with Brazil and what we did to convince Getúlio Vargas from coming out of the sidelines in World War II was really about supporting the growth of the agricultural sector in Brazil, supporting the growth of the steel industry in Brazil. Today, we need to see our engagement not as a with us or against us kind of manichaeist approach to the region, and one that shows that Brazil can depend on the United States when they look at kind of their aspirations to grow and compete on a global stage.
Thanks, Juan. I'm going to ask one more question, and then I want to go to the audience and engage the audience. So if you have questions, if you can start lining up at the microphones. So my last question is about insecurity. And so we talked a little bit about a lot about public insecurity already this morning. And I suspect that, that's going to be a conversation that's going to get woven into some of the other discussions that we have, particularly when we hit tech tomorrow. The question I have about insecurity, and I'm going to unfortunately tie it back into the conversation around strategic competition, but the United States has, just a robust mill-to-mill engagement in the region, and in fact, arguably the United States, in most, if not all cases, is the partner of choice. The U.S. military, and Southcom does an amazing job at sort of deepening, really consequential relationships with militaries. One area that I think the United States may be lacking is in the law enforcement engagement side. And I'm not discounting the amazing work that Department of State's INL does in terms of promoting law enforcement engagement, but it's nowhere near the robustness of our mill-to-mill. But we see the overwhelming insecurity, sort of domestic insecurity, being kind of prevalent in most political agenda across the region. But that, at the same time, that's an area that China seems to be throttling forward. not just sort of the proliferation of surveillance technologies and command centers to help address crime, but also, sort of the recent news around, pop-up, co-policing stations in which the Chinese have a physical footprint, Chinese law enforcement. It does a few things for the Chinese. On one end, I think it differentiates them as a security supporter, or engager in the region, but it also allows them to engage at very local levels as part of sort of localization, strategy. How does the U.S. sort of, what are you thinking about that competitive security landscape, and how can the U.S. sort of increase the law enforcement to law enforcement engagement side to be more competitive, ensure that, we're a referent when it comes to domestic, law enforcement capability?
Yeah, briefly, I'll touch upon the mill-to-mill, where I will argue that a lot of the future of war, and I'm sure you've written on this, as have your colleagues, is not going to include aircraft carriers, and that's a space where our competition with China it's much closer than I think traditional war. The expansion of strategic basing by China is something that is very concerning because it's seen, malign in its intent, and we've been engaging with countries on this. And I'll say that a lot of the challenge on the military-industrial cooperation with countries like Brazil and Argentina and Colombia and others, a lot of those bureaucratic challenges are internal to us, given how difficult it is to be able to share technology. Obviously, you have to make a business case for that, but it's something that I'll give a lot of credit to Dan Erickson, who's been leading some of these dialogues with Colombia, with Brazil, and other countries. It's something that we are tackling the internal bureaucracy that impedes our ability to be ambitious in that level of cooperation. Because ultimately, countries need to have assets, and either they're going to buy fighter jets from China or they're going to buy them from the United States. And it's in our interest to, I think, find ways to improve how DSCA really works. In Latin America, they have to pay cash up front. They really don't have a lot of the benefits in the kind of the grant system that low-income countries have. It's something that needs to be fixed. And then down the line would likely require legislation for us to be able to compete in that space. On the police side, I think this is it's illustrative, I think, of the broader governance challenge of Latin America and the Caribbean. And I'll say, I don't believe that we have this answered, because a lot of our focus in this space, traditionally international narcotics and law enforcement, are driven by domestic imperatives, meaning drugs and migration. And that's where a lot of the investment has been. But where we have made inroads is the Department of Homeland Security, not just DEA, DOJ, the State Department. I think particularly in our engagement with Mexico, have expanded intel cooperation, have expanded our cooperation on policing, but there's a lot more that certainly needs to be done, because what we are starting to see in places like South America is a lot of the kind of far right extreme movements that tried to overthrow Lula are in other parts of Latin America. They've been there since before World War II. But also today, the challenges of drug trafficking are not ones of cultivating coca in the jungles of Colombia and smuggling in tons. They are of organizations that are vertically integrated, that are multinational in nature, that are money laundering from Europe to Latin America. In that regard, we have started shifting approach by looking at, I think, the supply chains, the criminal supply chains, focusing less on the farmer that's cultivating and more on the financial infrastructure, the criminal organizations. But when it comes to issues like community policing, there's a lot more that needs to be done. And it is one of the reasons why the INL budget for Latin America and the Caribbean is one of the largest in the world. But there's a lot to be done and a lot for us to really, I think, learn and adapt to in what has been a very fast-changing security environment, particularly in the post-pandemic time.
Yeah, thanks for that, Juan. I appreciate that. And I think public security was such an important part of the agenda at the City Summit in Denver last week. And I guess that was the spirit of the question, understanding that our partners in the region are desperate for support in terms of law enforcement and the administration of justice, and how do we throttle forward in ways that we can support that. And so I appreciate your comments on that. So I'd like to go to the audience now for questions. I see we got one. If again, a question, so it has to have a question mark after it. and if you can also state your name and your affiliation in the process. So, sir, over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Gonzalez, for joining us today and for your time. My name is Elias Castilla. I am an international relations and political science student here at FIU. And I am, like you, Mr. Gonzalez, I am from Colombia. I'm from Barranquilla. And Colombia historically has been a strategic and critical ally of the United States. Despite this, it took the Biden administration 414 days, that's over a year, to grant President Duque a meeting with President Biden. And this was after a very extensive diplomatic effort and multiple meeting requests from the Colombian side. On the other hand, you gave President Petro, the Biden administration gave President Petro a meeting in less than 9 months. Historically, President Duque has been pro-American. Colombia aligned more with American values under President Duque administration. In fact, President Duque lived right here in Washington when he was working for the Inter-American Development Bank. Contrary to President Duque, President Petro has built an anti-American narrative for so long, even when he was in Congress. His ideas aligns more to the ideas of China and Russia. He has he spread an anti-imperialist rhetoric, and oftentimes he presents the United States as an obstacle for Latin American countries to flourish. Why did you ostracize and ignore Colombia under Duque's administration? Yet with President Petro, you reach out to Colombia and you suddenly turn our historical enemies into our friends, and not only enemies, but also leaders that advocate for countries that are violating human rights currently, like China, like Russia, and like Venezuela. Do you feel like your approach to Latin America does foster the United States values, does foster democratic values? And how is your reaction now that President Petro stands from the balcony of the presidential palace in Colombia and blatantly calls for a revolution? Thank you.
Yeah, no, so thank you for your question. Yeah, no, Elias, and I would disagree with the premise of your question, and I'll say why. President Biden has known every president of Colombia dating back to Pastrana when he first got engaged in Plan Colombia, and has had excellent relationships with him. I would say even out of office in 2018 as a former vice president, Dan Erickson and I traveled with then former Vice President Biden to Bogota in 2018, had an excellent conversation with President Duque as he was appointing his cabinet. And I think the U.S. has always been there for Colombia. If you measure it by virtue of presidential engagement and the timing of it, so I think you could argue that. I would say that the president's focus, particularly in the first year of the administration, was 100% on getting the United States back on a competitive track. And there was, admittedly, delays in engagement with not just countries in some countries in Latin America, but Europe and Africa that, waited for a long time because the president's exclusive focus was on the U.S. and the American people. And so after the midterm election, the focus has increased dramatically on the foreign policy side, I think appropriately. But I'll say this about Petro, and as a Colombian American, I think one can be personally conflicted about these approaches, but the focus really has to be fundamentally on national security interests of the United States. And our view to the election in Colombia was that we need to develop a constructive relationship regardless of who won the election. And what I would point to is that the rhetoric and the debates that are taking place in Colombia right now are ones that really are up for Colombians to decide. Colombia is the most unequal country in Latin America, the 7th most unequal in the world. And these debates about how to actually implement policies that address those are worthwhile. Do we agree with everything that is being said on both sides of that political debate? No, but it's not our place to be a party in those debates. But I would point to our effort of engaging with the Petro government at every level. We've had an amazing chargé down there, Paco Palmieri, who has led the country team in not trying to convince the Petro administration that they needed to continue everything of the Duque administration, but to correct misperceptions, brief them on what we're doing. The result has been that our cooperation on security, on military issues, on peace implementation, on corruption, all of that has remained, and if not improved, under the Petro administration, notwithstanding, I think, some of the rhetoric that has been exchanged on the topic.
Thanks, Juan. Thank you. We have time for one other question. I can't see the mic because of the podium, but I think Luisa is there. Is that right? All right, Luisa, you get the next question. Last question.
Hello, my name is Luisa Rincon. I am a political science major with a certificate in national security studies. And funny enough, I am also Colombian, so I appreciate the discussion that was also just had. As you mentioned earlier, China has increased their influence in Latin America, but touching a little bit more on the Lithium Triangle, what is the US doing specifically to combat China's prominent presence in the lithium mining sector, considering both the state-affiliated actors and those in the private sector? Thank you.
Thank you. It's a good question. I would also say that China has been very competitive, not just in buying up lithium reserves all over the world, and they're doing it whether or not the reserves are profitable or not. And I think it's after the fact, what they'll do is they'll drop the ones that they have no use for. It's hard for a market economy like the United States to compete that way, and so we need to really create the tools for the private sector to compete. So as I mentioned, DFC has expanded its authorities to some equities. Exim board has approved really expanding lending in this particular sector. But I think there's a distinctive difference is that I think whereas China, I think is maybe strong words, but I think is farming the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean. What we're trying to do is still, I think, invest in value added. So it's not just buying the reserves, but all the way up the supply chain, have excellent cooperation with Chile, with Argentina, and with a lot of the other countries, Bolivia, I think, accepted. And so that ultimately is one that is I think the approach to take. There's a lot more work that needs to be done in that space. I would say China has also been doing a lot to kind of build on your question, to invest in the development of electricity grids in Latin America. I think the updating of Argentina's electricity grid has been largely financed by China. But again, the opportunity cost of those decisions are ones where they usually come at a political cost, whereas the ones that we're trying to mobilize are ones that ultimately are intended to give agency and independence to the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean. But I think I would say that there's a lot more that needs to be done in this space to ensure that we give the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean options that they are looking for.
Juan, thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in a round of applause for Director Juan Gonzalez. Juan, thanks again for being so steadfast in your support for our conference, and have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.